Chapter 15. The Yellow-Eyed Dog. As Joe was putting the farm implements away in the shed, his dog began to growl. Joe could see nothing that would have bothered her, but he had learned to trust her senses more than his own. She turned toward the tree line and stood stiffly, sniffing the breeze. Soon her back hairs bristled from head to tail. With a terrible snarl, she shot away and across the plowed field, disappearing into the trees. Joe ran after her. Suddenly, he heard awful barks and snarls, mixed with high-pitched screams of pain. Two Trees first thought that the dog had scented some animal stalking the livestock. Perhaps a bear or a wildcat had come to raid the farm. He worried for the dog and grabbed a heavy branch to use as a club. When he reached the scene of the fighting, Joe saw that the dog needed no help from him. She had the quarry bloodied and down. It was not an animal, it was a man. Joe called the dog, but she was out of his control. She was bent on killing the man. Then Joe saw why. She had a deep gash over one eye where the stranger must have hit her with something. A few feet off, Joe saw the object. It was a long-barreled revolver. Blood clung wet and red, mixed with black hairs, to its length. Joe picked up the gun and fired it into the air. At the sharp blast, the dog jumped back, and Joe grabbed her by the back of the neck. He held her and soothed her with calm words until the bloodlust had gone from her eyes. Meanwhile, the stranger rolled himself away and propped his back against the trunk of a tree. He sat there, dazed and bleeding, watching the animal dumbly. When Joe was sure he had regained authority over the excited animal, he slowly let her go. She stood, glaring and growling, between her master and the man. Joe rose and tucked the gun into his waistband. The badly frightened man made no objection. Joe walked forward to examine the man's wounds. He still sat, speechless. He had several small tears, but most were not serious. The man's heavy winter clothing had absorbed much of the dog's fury. His right hand was more deeply bitten than any other place. The dog had apparently grabbed it in order to disarm the man. He was silently glad she had bitten that hand that had hurt her. Joe said nothing, but motioned for the man to rise. He did this, but with obvious pain. Joe pointed toward the clearing. He went to examine this man who stole silently upon isolated farms. Hunters carried rifles or shotguns, not pistols. Joe wanted him in the clear, away from the shadowy trees. He advised the stranger that only one word would bring the dog to the man's throat. In the plowed field, Joe looked the intruder over. He wore boots that had seen many roads. They were worn and thin. The rest of his clothing was torn and dirty. Some rips were new, made by the dog, but most were not. They spoke of much travel. His jacket, which might once have been blue, was fastened with a row of brass buttons. Joe demanded to know why the man had been hidden among the trees. With a quick look toward the dog, the man answered, honestly, that he had hoped to steal a chicken for food. He had probably decided the truth might go better on him than the possible consequences of any lie. Joe nodded. He could understand such a motive as hunger. The man said he was a farmer, but had most recently been a soldier. He told Joe enough for the Indian to know that he had been fighting in the war that was going on, the war that Cass had gone to join. There he had been badly wounded and then taken captive by his enemies. The man pulled aside the ripped leg of his trousers and pointed, as if offering proof of his story. Most of the calf muscle had been ripped away, and was only newly covered with poorly healed scar tissue. Joe understood then that the man's limp had not been caused entirely by his dog. The limp would accompany him for the balance of his life, but only if he was lucky enough to keep the mutilated leg at all. The Indian realized that this man was more to be pitied than feared. He was so weak that he would be able to offer no threat even if he wanted to try. The dog also seemed to have sensed this. She had done her job of protecting the master, and now that she believed there was no further danger, she ignored the man. But even as she disregarded him, she remained alert to all possibilities. She would let him live, but only as long as the master wanted it. Joe invited him to the farm for food and rest, but kept the pistol, not ready to give its power back to an unknown man. When they reached the house, Sheila stood on the porch watching them. Joe briefly explained the circumstances, and she showed concern for the man's cuts. He asked if there was a place nearby where he could wash. Joe pointed toward the river, telling the man that although the water was still cold, it was clean. The stranger smiled for the first time and said it would do fine. Then Sheila asked if he would care for her to come and wash his wounds. The man's second smile was abruptly halted by the jarring order Joe gave her. "Inside." He said only the one word, but its tone and intensity carried volumes of meaning. It was enough to set the dog's hair bristling again, and Sheila scurrying through the door. There was anger in the Indian, but it was not for the poor chicken thief. Joe went to the river and helped the man for a few moments, but his main concern was for the dog. He gently bathed her wound. The dog understood his good intentions, and she stood still in the cold water while he washed dirt from the bloody scalp. The touches must have brought some pain, but she never flinched. The hand of her master was always welcome. The three completed their wash and walked back to the farm. Even though the man still stole nervous glances at the black dog with its slightly reddened mark of white, Joe could tell she no longer was angry. That the dog seemed unperturbed went a long way toward settling any lingering doubts about the former soldier. Joe asked him to tell more about his captivity. It had been very short. The captors had expected him to die and had not watched him carefully. One night, he got up and simply limped out of their camp. Probably thinking he would soon die in the wilderness, they had not bothered to follow him. He fooled them and did not die, but he decided that he wanted no more war. Avoiding contact with friendly troops and enemy alike, he slowly made his way north. The stranger was heading for Albany. There, he had been a farmer, but that was almost 2 years earlier. Joe was sorry for the man, and silently decided to give him food for the rest of his journey. A meal and a place to rest for a day were all that would be added to the food, however. He had learned, years ago, that one who gets overly involved in the problems of others would neglect his own needs. Joe would send this man on his way the next day, toward whatever was ultimately to be his fate. When the old Indian told me this part of his story, I was not quite sure if I detected some small note of jealousy. If it was actually jealousy for the dwindling romance with Sheila, I don't think Two Trees was even aware of it. He simply wanted the man gone, so he would not have to add him as a factor to contend with in his formula for survival. Also, then he could give back the pistol and be rid of it. It was not a conscious matter of distrust, but even though the dog seemed satisfied, the man had sneaked up on them once before. Joe took the gun from his waist and studied it. It looked to be a very efficient weapon. Trusting the stranger was one thing, but risking the lead from his pistol was entirely another. Joe released the cylinder and emptied its remaining cartridges into his hand. He looked at them for a moment, and then toward the house. No one was in sight. He reached back and threw the bullets as far away as he could. The dog watched silently as they fell among the leaves and were lost. He scratched her gently behind the ears, careful to avoid the long, matted gash, and her tail waved approval. She stayed close to his leg as they walked to the house. When he entered, the man and Sheila were closely examining the newspaper. It was spread open on the table, and they were both hunched over it, speaking of places he had never heard about. Then he saw that the whiskey bottle stood open between them. The two had ignored him until then, but Sheila noticed his irritation and offered him a drink. To be included, he accepted. She fetched a glass and poured a quantity for him. Joe picked it up and sniffed. Then he noticed that they were both watching him with an air of expectation. Self-consciously, he hefted the glass to his mouth and downed it at a gulp. First his eyes watered, then his throat began to burn, and finally he was taken over by a fit of coughing. The two laughed at him until tears ran from their eyes. It had been a great joke to everyone except Joe. He rose and silently left the house. He walked in darkness, accompanied by yellow eyes, until, eventually, his anger and resentment ebbed. The warming breeze of a spring evening soothed and calmed him. Joe forced himself to see the whiskey incident as a harmless prank, and as he walked to the cabin, he almost believed it. Joe went back inside, trying very hard to smile. The effort was wasted on the other two. Much of the whiskey was gone, and they disregarded Two Trees' return. They were laughing and talking, giving the appearance of two very old friends, rather than people who had met only earlier that same day. They were still talking about the war, and Sheila seemed pleased to hear the man's view that the North would soon be victorious. Joe, in no way concerned about the war's outcome, was none the less interested in Sheila's reactions. During all the time Two Trees had known her, she had never even mentioned the war. The friendly pair finally remembered Joe's presence, and the man asked if he was an Indian. Joe guardedly admitted that he was. He sensed or expected trouble over this, but the other only smiled and nodded. The Indian was glad it had not come to more, but still he was anxious to be done with this soldier. The sooner he was gone, the better Joe would feel about the whole matter. The Indian inquired if the stranger planned to leave early the next day. The affirmative response encouraged him, and he took the revolver out. He told the stranger he would give it back now to save him time in the morning. Joe placed it on the table, and the man took it. In the same motion he rose and spun toward the door where the dog lay watching. He aimed and pulled the trigger, but the hollow click of an empty chamber sounded almost simultaneously with the grinding crunch of strong teeth meeting bone. The dog had launched herself as soon as he began to turn. The sight of that hated metal club had been all the impetus needed to turn her into a raging beast. She grabbed his hand, disarming him as she had earlier in the trees. There was a difference, though. This time she would not release her grip. Her large black body pinned the former soldier across the chest as she gnawed at his hand. The sound of splintering bone was unmistakable. The man screamed in fear and pain, but Joe only looked on. The woman was horrified and unable even to scream. She watched the growing pool of blood, then suddenly turned and ran behind the curtain of blankets. Slowly, Joe picked up the pistol. For want of any better way to destroy it, he dropped the weapon into the hearth fire. Joe stood in front of the fire, deliberately watching the gun's wooden hand grips char and burst into flame. When he judged that the dog had spent sufficient time exacting her revenge, he turned to her and called softly. She either didn't hear or chose to disregard him. At last he had to pull her roughly away from the slobbering man. Joe absently noticed two indisputable facts. The broad red stain would never be fully removed from the plank floor, and the limping farmer would never again find any serious use for his right hand. Two Trees held his dog and allowed the man to rise on wobbly feet. He staggered, and for a moment Joe thought he might be physically unable to leave. Then the man straightened and looked fearfully toward the door. The Indian told him to go, and he added that he would soon release the dog to follow him. Although he hadn't any intention of doing so, the soldier had no way of knowing it. The last that Joe saw of him was his stumbling silhouette retreating into the darkness. Somehow, Joe was very sure that they had seen the last of the wounded deserter. Some time elapsed while Two Trees sat at the table, with the big animal's head resting across his lap. He crooned to her, soothing back the killer part that showed visibly through her brilliant eyes. The dog had forgiven her hurt once, but when the stranger threatened her a second time, he had committed an unpardonable act. In all the world, she wanted but one thing at that moment. She wanted to hunt. She wanted to follow the hated man relentlessly across forest and field and overtake him. As Joe ran his hands across her broad back, he could feel the rigid musculature, tensed for combat. The pleading look she gave him told him all he wanted to know. Two Trees shuddered. He had no wish to see the man killed. He had only wanted him gone, and that he surely was. It was quite late when Sheila came back into the room. She was white to a frightening degree, and tear stains marked her face. She walked past Joe, giving both him and the dog a very wide berth. The partly filled bottle still stood where it had been. She sat down across from him and lifted it to her lips. Joe watched, amazed that she could tolerate the burning fluid. The level grew lower and lower as it emptied down her throat. She seemed to be trying hard, with eyes forced shut, to close out the bloody mess around her and the vivid horror within. When she put the bottle down, the whiskey was nearly gone. Still holding her eyes shut, Sheila spoke to Joe. The cold hatred in her voice was evident with the first syllable. The dog was calm by that time, but the sound of that voice brought her hairs up in a growl to her throat. At the same time, Joe recognized in Sheila's voice some quality that told him he had been a fool. No wife or mother, no loving partner could this woman ever be. She told Joe, as sarcastically as she could, that he and his horrible dog were both animals as far as she was concerned. She told him he should forget about trying to wear clothing like a man. He should run naked in the woods with a filthy bitch, attacking decent white people as they went. He was not fit company for human beings. She cried that Joe had managed to run off the only white man to visit her since her husband left for the army. "But," she added, "I hope you stay around here. When my husband does return, I will see that he kills you and your bitch." Joe rose and calmly said that he would take her advice about staying with the dog. Then he would know he was in better company than now. As he left, he knew there would be nothing further between them, but he realized, too, that there had been little from the start. She had needed meat and farm work, and had paid for them. He wasn't angry at her. He had given, and he had gotten in return. If he had been foolish enough to believe she saw more in him than what he was, her parting speech about decent white people showed him that the error had been his. Joe knew it was much better this way. He was, again, a free being. Now he even had the great black guardian. He was not angry, and he tried not to feel hurt. For the most part, he was successful, but still, there had been the hope. As Joe told me the part of his story that included Sheila, I was too young to fully understand. Yet, in my later years, I would remember it all, and I would also remember that although he had insisted it was really unimportant, he contradicted himself by spending more time on Sheila's story and recalling more details than on any other. While he told it, I could feel that I'd become a part of each scene. His description of cloud colors and passing seasons were so vivid, I often sensed he was living it again through the telling. Even as he spun a web of cruelty and promiscuity, in which the girl's character was inexorably trapped, he hastened, periodically, to defend her. "It was not really her fault. How could she have been otherwise?" he said more than once. Joe was a human being who saw goodness in beauty, and beauty in nature. The woman was beauty to his eyes, and so she was naturally good. This, with him, was not rationalization, but instinct. I suggest, much over the protestations of a long-dead Indian, that Joe loved her very much. He loved her for the physical, the emotional, and for the deeply seated hope that somehow he would not be the last of his line. Yes, I think that even as he damned her, Joe loved her still. I believe that the little campfire at Hunter Island burned brighter for him as he told of the girl, and it was joined by a flame in his heart that had never quite gone out. There is a last fact. Joe never tried again to establish any relationship with another woman. He left her that night and only saw her once again. That once was from a distance. He more than left. Joe removed himself from her. The distance that separated them could have been as broad as the gulf between the stars, but it was, in actuality, only as far as his wigwam. The Indian spent several days near the home, thinking of his next journey. He wasn't upset by Sheila's threat about her husband. During the winter, he had strongly suspected that there was such a person anyhow. Joe now knew of the dog's abilities and her strong urge to protect him, so he was sure no man could sneak up undetected. The years had also taught him to rely on his strength and cunning. Together, thought Joe, they were a match for any man.